In the last few weeks, there has been a noticeable change in American public discourse about the war in Ukraine. The practicality, morality, and ideology of military aid to Ukraine is being questioned in an ever-increasing series of objections. Some of the objections are valid and need to be addressed, while others have no merit at all. And then there's pure Russian propaganda, which managed to seep into the consciousness of the public in Western countries. Let's take the most widespread arguments and separate fact from fiction. Number one, by providing Ukraine better weapons, we're risking escalation. Escalation means that you do something qualitatively different that causes the other side, in this case Russia, to shift to more radical means of warfare. One problem with this argument is that it makes Ukraine and its allies look like the aggressor, as if Russia is doing nothing to merit more effective weapons. But in fact, Putin has been escalating since February 2022, with bombing atomic energy stations in the south, bombing Ukrainian peaceful infrastructure, using foreign Iranian drones and mercenaries from the Middle East, raping women, children, and so forth. It's not the West who's escalating, it's Kremlin. The West would be responding to the escalation at worst. Secondly, who decides at which point an action becomes escalation? The argument goes that the more help to Ukraine will trigger a disproportionately bigger response from Russia. But why hasn't it so far? First, HIMARS was going to be the trigger. Hitting targets on occupied territory was going to be the trigger. Now, Patriot systems. The US and European countries have been sending Ukraine progressively heavier weapons to the point where we can now push Russians out with incredible speed in some areas. With so many red lines crossed, why hasn't Kremlin responded as we feared? Former President Medvedev of Russia had promised Ukraine a day of judgment if anything on what they consider to be Russian territory was going to be destroyed. But that has happened at least a dozen times in the last 3 months. Why hasn't any of the increasingly aggressive aid provoked a response? As a part of this argument, some fear that Russia just hasn't been pushed enough to use their real force or other means that they have. In fact, that's what Putin said in October. We haven't started anything serious yet. But it's another bluff. Since Putin announced that occupied territories are now part of Russia, Ukrainian forces have taken back large areas, including Kherson, the only large city occupied since February. In other words, Ukrainians have taken territory already officially claimed as Russian. That should have triggered the Russian defense doctrine, which would deploy, they're called other means, in response to existential threats. Still, no radical measures from Russia. So why no doomsday? It's because the fear of escalation is the weapon they use, the real weapon. Which leads us into the next argument. By helping Ukraine, we're risking World War III. Is it worth going to war with Russia over a little Ukrainian territory? This argument is right from Russian propaganda's playbook. Putin and his circle are cultivating an image of themselves as madmen. They don't care if they die as long as you die. In one of the more infamous interviews, Putin had responded to a question about nuclear war with, "What do we care? They will perish, but we will go to heaven." They want you to think that you have everything to lose, but they have nothing to lose, so you better back off. But it's a bluff. In fact, Putin and his elites love their life and preserve it at great costs. They make their money in Russia, where no law can stand in their way, but spend it in wealthy Europe, where riches are protected by property rights. Oligarchs, MPs, propagandists, and Putin himself own huge estates, yachts, planes, and other luxuries in Europe and the United States. They don't want to lose it. Putin loves life. He has been hiding in the bunker the entire 2 years of the pandemic. Everybody who comes to see him must be in isolation for 2 weeks prior to meeting him. The less we say about the length of the table in his office, the better. These things don't paint a picture of a man who's willing to blow himself up for his ideology. Next, Putin's legitimacy rests on the popular support inside Russia, or at least perceived popular support. He watches his numbers closely. In dictatorial regimes, the might of the leader is what makes him the leader. That's why the draft points to him not being ready for World War III. General draft that he announced in September was costlier to his popularity numbers than prospect of atomic war. Think about it. If he had announced that Russia had hit London with a nuclear weapon, his popularity would go through the roof with his own people. If his image of a madman with the red button was true, this would have been his next move. Instead, he announces mobilization, which even most of his loyal followers understand means death. Their fathers, sons, providers going to war that's going very poorly for them, with a chance of over 50% of them coming back in body bags. The draft hurts Putin's popularity and risks internal unrest, but Putin still chooses that instead of escalating. His nuclear rhetoric is a bluff. Finally, launching a nuclear weapon is a process with 7 to 10 links, which means that Putin has to issue orders to his staff, and they do the same down the chain 7 to 10 times. And any break in the chain could mean that the launch is either delayed, not carried out, or sabotaged. Every officer in the chain of command understands that mutually assured destruction will wipe out his own family within 10 minutes after he carries out his orders. It's a huge if that everyone in the chain of command will follow through on his own suicide and certain death of his family. The weapon in the nuclear standoff is intimidation, which unfortunately is very effective on Western societies. Number 3, we have no reason to be involved in a foreign conflict. Yes, US doesn't have to be involved in any affairs if the people or the government don't want to. It's not even for anyone like me to comment on. But globally speaking, isolationism is not a good strategy though, because the world is interconnected in terms of economies, but also crime and terrorism. Prices on imported goods, gas, terrorist activity in the US, human trafficking, that all depends on the stability of Europe and Asia. In my conversation with former General Ben Hodges, he fully supports this thought. The United States is interested in the stability of Europe since it is the largest trading partner to the US. President Zelensky mentioned this in his address to the US Congress as well. The US support to Ukraine is not charity, but an investment in global security. It would be nearsighted on the part of the United States to say, because there is no war in our territory, there is no danger. I've said this many times before, the war the Kremlin wages is on the West. Ukraine is just the front lines. Many of Putin's MPs have said that once we are done with Ukraine, Estonia is going to be next. There are billboards across Russia with the slogan, "Our motherland has no borders." Putin has previously mentioned that they consider Europe all the way up to the English Channel to be their territory. Everything west of Ukraine is NATO territory, which means that if Ukraine falls and Russia goes over there, American troops will have to be involved by NATO Article 5. Right now, the US is only spending money to restore stable Europe. Number 4, Ukraine is corrupt. American money is being stolen by oligarchs. Let's acknowledge something that is obvious. Yes, there's corruption in Ukraine. That's a problem that exists and has proven to be difficult to overcome, although in the last 7 years, we have come a long way to eradicate corruption at the level of public services. But it doesn't mean that Ukrainian oligarchs are buying property in Europe with our money. That's slander which certain unscrupulous journalists have picked up from Russian propaganda masquerading as unbiased news. RT, for example, Russia Today. It's very important to distinguish between we don't have the clarity on what's going on with the money that's being sent and Ukrainian oligarchs are stealing our money. First thing is true and is being improved right now. The second is pure speculation. There's just no evidence for it. The reason those opposing the aid of Ukraine conflate the two is because it's easy to take a true statement about problems with tracking and turn it into a completely false accusation that the aid is being stolen. Let's take this argument apart. First, it's a myth that there is no control over the money, weapons, or humanitarian aid that's being shipped to Ukraine. There's a number of ways the aid is being tracked. Through a blockchain software by Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, self-reporting by Ukrainian troops, and special third-party software developed by Deloitte Digital and used by US aid. Moreover, the US is planning to establish a program called Monitoring, Evaluation, and Audit Services for Ukraine Reporting, MEASURE, which will run remote and in-person monitoring of the aid to Ukraine. Secondly, full audit of every dollar is not feasible at the time of war. Rather, it's a tactic on the part of the opposers to completely stymie the help until a full investigation is complete. Sounds like a virtue, but has a sinister hidden agenda. Accountability is the right move here, of course. Ukraine is not against it, but it doesn't come as an expense report you can just throw up on the big screen at the next session of Congress. The usual format of these reports, such as end-user monitoring, wasn't designed for wartime. And the protocols used in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, are not compatible since there are no US troops in Ukraine. The format of accountability is being developed right now since the situation that we are in is unprecedented. Next, Nothing in what we know and hear from the US officials suggests that Ukraine is evading accountability, much less stealing money to buy real estate in Europe. Representative Sarah Jacobs, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, says that every indication I've seen is in fact that there hasn't been misuse of weapons. Lastly, you can see the results of on the battlefield. 4 HIMARS systems in the summer were able to turn the tide of the war and let Ukraine go on the offensive. Artillery systems enabled us to take back Kharkiv in the north and Kherson in the south. These are visible results of how effective the aid from the US and Europe is. Ukraine's own machinery and weapons left over from the Soviet Union could not have achieved such astonishing results against the prevailing Russian force. Number 5. We have our own problems in the US. Let's solve them before we help anyone else. This is a valid argument. Usually people who use it would say that this past year, the inflation has been out of control. Prices for food and gas have risen significantly. Why is it a priority to help Ukraine, even if it's the right thing to do? Don't we have to take care of our own first? It's the prerogative of the American people where to spend their money, but I ask you to consider 2 things in this regard. 1, it's in the US interest to grind Russia down. As I mentioned before, Russia's geopolitical enemy is the United States, which means that deterring Kremlin takes significant resources from the US. Arms race, intelligence and counterintelligence, flows of arms from Russia to satellite states and terrorist regimes, economic instability and threats to peace around the world due to Russia's ambitions, etc., etc. Using the current opportunity to weaken Putin's regime for several decades is a very good investment into the future of economy and leadership status of the US in the world, which of course translates into soft power for the US, which translates into prosperity of its citizens. Second, the war in Ukraine is costing US only money. 7% of defense budget to be exact. I won't pontificate about how Ukraine is paying with blood and compare blood with money, but at 7% of yearly defense budget, for the weakening of the biggest threat to the free world is a hell of a bargain. Ukraine knows what it's doing and how to defeat Russian aggression, but we need weapons, money, and humanitarian aid to defeat a common enemy. To me, it sounds like a great deal. Number 6. Putin and Zelenskiy are the same, 2 warlords battling it out. This objection is being used as a deflection. The opposers are deliberately misrepresenting aid to Ukraine as help to Zelensky, quote unquote, not Ukraine as to say that we're giving money to a corrupt politician rather than a people who are defending their land with their own bodies. Putin and Zelensky do not even compare. Setting aside conspiracy theories that Ukraine has been run by the CIA in the last 8 years, here are the facts. Our president wasn't in politics until 3 years ago. He made his money as an entertainer. He's known as a tough negotiator and a demanding business leader. He's not perfect, of course. There are allegations of misuse of government funds and pulling his friends into positions of power, but there is no comparing the two. Zelensky was elected in a fair democratic election, unlike Putin, evidenced by international observers' lack of challenge to his legitimacy from within. Personally, I voted for the other guy, but I have no doubt that Zelensky was elected fairly. Unlike Putin, he doesn't imprison his political rivals. He doesn't limit free speech. He doesn't put people in prison for holding political views different than his own. He doesn't change the constitution to make himself president forever. He didn't build a rigid pyramid scheme where every cop on the beat kicks up the money he had racketed from a local business up the chain so the president and his elites can build yachts and $100 million boats. The comparison is factually incorrect and intellectually dishonest. The fact is that Ukraine is a sovereign state which is viciously attacked without a cause by an empire wannabe who is known for its aggression around the world. Number 7, there are neo-Nazi battalions in the Ukrainian armed forces. This was one of the original pieces of propaganda that Russia had put out at the beginning of the war. You may remember that the 2 goals of the war they had initially proclaimed, but now pretend not to have done so, were demilitarization and denazification. The implication of denazification was that back in 2014, when Yanukovych, who was Putin's puppet president, fled the country, Ukraine was overtaken by neo-Nazi government, which oppressed the Ukrainian people, the more particularly Russian-speaking population. This was propagated on the internal Russian market for years and used as casus belli in February. Now that rhetoric had gone away because Kremlin realized there is no way they can defend it. Instead, they narrowed it down to one special operations battalion called Azov as being of neo-Nazi ideology. But even that has nothing to do with the reality. Even though, just like in any army, you would find a rare soldier professing Nazism, it doesn't mean it's not the same as the whole army or even a battalion being neo-Nazi. This argument is nothing but a play on a political hot topic to rile up Western audiences. Russian propaganda is good at that, using divisive conversations in the West to put its own agenda forward. Do not be fooled by this, friends. Number 8, Ukraine is persecuting and imprisoning Christians. You may have heard that it's immoral to support Ukrainian government because it's persecuting the church. Nothing like this is happening. In fact, 2 weeks ago, my dad's church held a conference for military chaplains who are currently serving on the front lines. This falsehood comes from a recent bill in the Ukrainian parliament to ban Russian Orthodox Church. There's a good reason to do so, since Russian Orthodox Church is in fact an enclave of KGB in Ukraine. Some priests are card-carrying KGB agents. Of course, by KGB, I mean it in its present form, FSB. In the last month, there have been a number of raids on suspected priests from the Russian church, which turned out the evidence. Propaganda literature, evidence of separatist activity in Ukrainian territory through the church, and one of the priests was caught with a choir boy in his bed. Yeah. Ukraine is not persecuting, much less imprisoning Christians. It's persecuting Russian spies inside Ukraine who use church to advance divisive agenda into the Ukrainian society. Last time I checked, Jesus too chased this kind out with whip. Friends, you may have noticed that I've flagged a lot of these objections as being right from Russian propaganda playbook. There are indications from sources that I follow that some time ago, Russia had started an active disinformation campaign targeted at Western audiences. Some news sources picked up this propaganda and are disseminating it unwittingly. Others do so with full understanding. Propaganda is dangerous because it mixes a little bit of fact with a whole lot of a truthful spin, which seems just plausible enough. I hope that this video helped you clarify various objections to aid to Ukraine, as well as get an insight of what's actually going on the ground in Ukraine. If you know someone who is holding one of these 8 false views, please share this video with them. Until next time.